Hello, my name is Abigail Gonzalez, and my presentation will be about reducing racial disparities in sentence lengths. To begin, I chose this problem because it was an issue brought up by Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow. After doing some research for my first essay, I realized that on average, Black offenders receive 19.1% of a longer sentence compared to white offenders. In the graph, you can see throughout the years how it has increased. It is also important to note that these numbers do control factors such as crime, criminal history, and education. So if you wanted to say that maybe because a Black person had a more extensive criminal history, they already took control of that and it has no play into the sentence. After everything is controlled, these are the numbers that reflect. A few causes of this disparity deals with the criminalization of Blacks, a bias within the initial prosecution, and most importantly, crack cocaine policies. The reason it is important to take notice of crack cocaine policies is because crack is the version of cocaine that is more popular among Black communities. That is because it is less expensive, whereas the powder version is more common for white users since it is a little bit more luxurious. This is important because crack receives a harder punishment, which ultimately causes a huge disparity between whites and Blacks in sentencing. Because Blacks are more prone to use crack, which receives a harder punishment, they are the ones who are getting the longer sentences. Some reasons that crack receives a harder punishment, it is because it is highly addictive and the dealers are more likely to be violent compared to powder cocaine dealers or users. So how did the crack cocaine disparities begin? It began with the anti-drug abuse of 1986. It established the 100-to-1 disparity for crack cocaine and imposed mandatory minimums for single possession. An example of this would mean that 5 grams of crack cocaine would result in the minimum sentence that would give 500 grams of powder cocaine. A solution that many advocates bring up is reducing the disparity ratio from 18-to-1 to 1-to-1. The Fair Sentencing Act was a step toward fairness, but the 18-to-1 ratio was a compromise and it still reflects an outdated and discredited assumptions about crack cocaine. Because crack and powder cocaine are two forms of the same drug, there should not be any disparity in sentencing between the two. The only fair solution would be 1-to-1, as quoted by ACLU. This would allow for no discrepancies between white and Black offenders in sentence lengths just because that they vary in which drug they choose to use. On the graph on the right, you can see how the sentence lengths have become closer, yet still there remains a gap. This gap will not be closed so long that the disparity is 18-to-1, 5-to-1, or so on. It must be 1-to-1, an equal sentence. An advocate for the 1-to-1 ratio is an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as ACLU. They are a nonprofit organization that works in the courts, legislatures, and communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed to all people in this country by the Constitution and laws of the United States. The solution would begin with the ACLU drafting a proposal, taking it to the United States Sentencing Commission, which would then issue and submit the amendment to Congress. This has been done in the past when they asked for a 20-to-1 ratio. In terms of feasibility, it would not be a problem being that this isn't the first time that the crack cocaine policies have changed. As mentioned before, the anti-drug abuse of 1986 established the 100-to-1 disparity for the crack cocaine policies. 24 years later, the Fair Sentencing Act was signed into law, which reduced that ratio to 18-to-1. At the time the Fair Sentencing Act was passed, the law was not retroactive. This meant cases that took place before 2010 were stuck with their original case. No later than another 8 years, the First Step Act was signed with Donald Trump in 2018. This meant changes to mandatory minimums for certain drug offenders, retroactivity of the Fair Sentencing Act, which meant that those who were sentenced before 2018 would now let the Fair Sentencing Act apply for their cases, and an expanding the safety valve. This goes to show that the law is constantly changing and it is still possible to improve the policies that were implemented in the past. In addition, this act was endorsed and signed by President Trump. He said, "The First Step Act will make communities safer and save tremendous taxpayers' dollars. It brings much needed hope to many families during the holiday season." I still don't have exact numbers. However, I do believe that reducing the sentence for many inmates would mean that they get out sooner, thus less money spent on them. For California alone, it costs an average of about $81,000 per year to incarcerate an inmate to prison. This means that if they were to get out sooner, that would be less money spent on them. This is something that I still have to look into. That is pretty much the end of my presentation. However, I just do have a little bit of concerns or roadblocks that I'm coming across as I'm doing my paper. One is that the implementation part, there is no specific steps given by the ACLU to implement the 1-to-1 ratio. I am just using what the USSC has done in the past to advocate for a reduction in the ratio. I'm not sure if that's a problem. They are advocates of the 1-to-1. They've expressed that in a quote, but they don't outline the steps to get there or what they're doing to get there, since it's a more general thing of reforming sentencing and the criminal system. It's not specific. It's not that specific. Lastly, my other issue is just finding the cost of implementing this change. I'm not sure if my reasoning of reducing a sentence would mean less money spent on the inmate is enough or strong enough. But thank you for listening to my presentation. Also, if you have any questions or concerns or advice or any comments about my presentation and what I said, I would really appreciate it if you reached out to me. Thank you. Also, thank you for being a really great teacher. I really enjoyed your class and your insight. It was one of my favorite classes at UCI. Thank you.